Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Alice McKay and I'm the chair, and Isabel Cassidy is the timekeeper. The adjudicators are Mr. Saxon, Miss Admiral and Mr. Brucker. The topic of this debate is that parents should be able to choose their baby's gender. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Pembroke School. The negative team seated to my left is from Pedare College. The speaking time for this debate is 5 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please ensure your mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Zoltan.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we are debating the topic that parents should be allowed to choose their baby's gender. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. I would firstly like to clarify that our team defines gender as the sexual assignment of a baby, their biological makeup, not the gender identity. As the first affirmative speaker for tonight's debate, I would also like to clarify the definition of the topic. We define parents as the persons or couples involved in commissioning the in vitro fertilization or IVF procedure, resulting in the conception of a child that they will legally be responsible for. We interpret the phrase "should be allowed to choose their baby's gender" as being afforded the freedom to choose the sex of the embryo before fertilization using sperm sorting, or choosing the sex of the embryo before implantation in the uterus, also known as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or PGD. We define baby as the live-born infant after birth. Sex selection may be crucial in some cases because it avoids certain sex-linked inherited diseases to be passed on to the baby. For example, haemophilia is a serious sex-linked inherited disease that is only passed on to males. Since our team understands this to be a widely accepted indication of for sex selection, we will therefore concentrate our arguments on sex selection for non-medical grounds. Many of the issues raised tonight will not only apply to Australia, but to many other countries. Tonight I will remind you of how everyone deserves the freedom of choice. I will also stress how preconception sex selection is safer and morally more ethical than sex selection by abortion, abandonment into orphanages, and infanticide. I will also discuss how preconception sex selection will aid families in achieving more gender balance. Our second speaker, Michelle, will then highlight how gender selection will help ensure a positive relationship between parents and a child, if the child is of the desired sex. She will also talk about how, since preconception sex selection is in such high demand, the procedures should be legalised more widely. Our third speaker, Eleanor, will rebut the opposition and summarise our case. Firstly, parents should be able to choose their baby's gender because they deserve the right to freedom of choice. In our modern, liberal society, everyone is free and equal, and basic rights of an individual must be respected. Since preconception sex selection does not restrict the rights of others or cause harm to any individuals, including the baby, non-medical sex selection should be legalised because it is a legitimate exercise of an individual's reproductive liberty. Dr. David McCarthy, a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Bristol, has found no evidence that sex selection technologies for parental preference do any harm to the babies or their parents. The decisions would only impact the family concerned, and by definition affect them positively. Therefore, parents should be able to choose their baby's gender because they are entitled to the freedom of choice and hence their reproductive liberty. Secondly, allowing preconception sex selection avoids abortions, avoids infanticide, and also prevents the abandonment of children in orphanages for gender reasons, which are inherently abhorrent. Unlike PGD, abortion for sex selection poses psychological stress on pregnant women, as well as risk of complications such as infections, internal bleeding, and even death. Also, infections after abortion can reduce a woman's future fertility. Parents should be allowed to choose their baby's gender preconception if desired. This is because it will result in less unnecessary, potentially unsafe, but paradoxically legal abortion for sex selection. Lastly, parents should be able to choose their baby's gender because they may desire a more gender-balanced family. Professor of Practical Bioethics in Oxford University, Julian Savulescu, believes that family balancing prevents social harm. Rather than causing gender imbalance, he has shown that when given a choice, many parents are more likely to choose both sexes rather than one sex more than the other. This will prevent the gender imbalance in some cultures, which prefer one specific gender. Family balancing may be important to some families because it prevents disappointment and social costs to some parents who bear multiple children of the same sex, hoping to finally achieve the desired gender. Such disappointments can lead to poor parental bonding with the newborn, postnatal depression, and even risk troubled relationship with the child. Our second speaker, Michelle, will elaborate on this further. A balanced family is beneficial because children raised with a sibling of the opposite gender can learn early in life to relate and socialise better with members of the opposite sex. Parents should be allowed to choose their baby's gender because it allows families to have both sexes if desired, in turn benefiting family relationships and society. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the availability of preconception sex selection technology has now given us a unique choice. Like all new technologies, it is invariably met by hysterical and dogmatic opposition, often fueled by irrational fears. I hope my arguments have persuaded you that the ethics, morality, and safety of preconception sex selection are sound and fair, and therefore should justly be allowed. Thank you.
Call upon the first negative speaker, Jackson Nicholas.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, Opposition, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that parents should be allowed to choose their baby's gender. We disagree with the definition given by the affirmative team, as we believe that the gender selection would take place before birth, not before conception. However, as the negative team, strongly believe that parents should not be able to choose their baby's gender. Tonight, as first speaker, I'll be discussing unconditional love, ethics, and the fact it may cause a severe gender imbalance. As second speaker, Thomas, will be speaking about financial and economical problems and consequences for future generations. Our third speaker, Elijah, will be rebutting the points put forward by the opposition, summarising a case, and assuring you that parents should most certainly not be able to choose their baby's gender. Before I commence my argument, I would like to point out some flaws in the opposition's case. The first affirmative speaker has mentioned that allowing parents to choose their baby's gender would create a gender balance. This is incorrect, as in many countries, such as China, already have a gender imbalance because one sex is preferred over the other. Implementing this legislation would allow for parents to continuously choose that preferred gender over the other, eventually resulting in that gender dominating those countries. Our third speaker will further elaborate on this rebuttal in his speech. Now on to my points. Firstly, the selection of gender destroys bonds between a parent and a child and many ethical values in society. Whatever happened to the unconditional love of your children? Imagine the heartbreaking sorrow that you would feel if you found out that your parents didn't feel you perfect as you are. Growing up, knowing that you have been tailored to your parents' selfish desires simply because they wanted to balance the family. How is it acceptable for a modern, accepting society to support this cruelty? Furthermore, the methods that sex selection employs are utterly unnatural and often cruel. For example, is abortion for these reasons not equal to having an uneventful, safe birth, and then taking a knife to the child simply because they are the wrong gender? Is the Erickson method, or sperm sorting, not akin to travelling to a shopping centre and picking out exactly what you want. Even if this was allowed, the ethical implications would have hideously adverse effects on the issues of sexism and equality. Gender selection would exemplify and perpetuate sexism in its purest and most blatant form, such as destroying the current efforts up to this point in eradicating it. It would further fuel the fire of gender stereotypes, confining children to a single state of mind for their whole life. These stereotypes would even further fuel the intolerance of transgenders and homosexuals in our society, increasing the pressure on males and females to conform to the sexual orientations forced upon them. The sheer psychological cruelty of sex selection is extremely unacceptable, and aside from extreme issues within the workplace, educational centres, and simply in public, there are other horrifying implications for sexism that come with an extreme gender imbalance, which leads me to my next point. Parents choosing their baby's gender will result in a severe gender imbalance. There are already gender imbalances in countries such as China, Bangladesh, South Korea, India, and Pakistan, with the sex ratio being 80 girls to every 100 boys, largely because of abortion due to a gender preference. Implementing this legislation will increase this rate incredibly and allow for an uncountable number of a certain gender to be born, massively outweighing the other. As this has already happened, it could easily occur in other countries as well. Also, such an increase in boys has resulted in sexual crime rates going up dramatically. In Asia, excess men already threaten regional and global stability. Furthermore, the population growth would be exponentially affected. For example, if there were multiple men born to one female, the population growth would plummet, and vice versa. These imbalances could lead to further mass sexism. One gender could be so rare that they are held in their nirvana, as they are essential to the survival of the human race. This would eventually spiral out of control and lead to a horrifically divided population. So in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, parents should not be able to choose their baby's gender, as it is destroying unconditional love, is highly unethical, and will result in a catastrophic gender imbalance.
Call upon the second affirmative speaker, Michelle Woods.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chair. The topic for tonight's debate is that parents should be able to choose their baby's gender. We, the affirmative team, strongly agree with this statement. Firstly, I would like to disagree with the changes to the definition made by the negative team. We still believe, as the affirmative team, that the procedures are preconception. Before I get into my points, I feel it is a necessity to point out the defects in the first negative speaker's arguments. The first speaker of the negative team has said there would be an imbalance in the gender population. We believe this is false because, like Zoe has already said, many people choose to have an equal amount of each gender. This way of selecting gender could actually improve the gender balance. As for countries like China who are already populated mostly by men, mothers are already choosing to abort their child if it is not male. Aborting is actually killing the baby after the contraception. IVF gender selection is a much better alternative than this. Also, China's one-child policy prevents mothers from having more than one baby, so there wouldn't be excess amount of men anyway. Being able to choose the gender of your unborn child is much better than aborting if it's not the desired gender. And since most people want an equal amount of both genders, it's definitely more ethical and morally correct than abortion. The first speaker of the negative team also said that parents won't love the children as much if they are not the right gender. We are not saying that gender affects how much the parent loves the child. When parents start thinking about the possibility of a child, many parents have a preference to gender. We, the affirmative team, believe that if parents desperately want a girl or a boy, and they think that it would benefit them as a family, that the opportunity should be available to them without having to fly overseas to get this done. Many parents also want a boy and a girl. This means that if they have a baby and it's one gender, that using gender selection and modern technology, they can guarantee the undergender to keep the family balanced, like Zoe has pointed out. Now that I have defended Zoe's case, I will begin on my arguments. Tonight, I will be talking about how gender selection can help build a bond as well as a healthy relationship between the parents and the child, as well as how people are already going overseas to get this done, and if the demand is high enough, then this service should be more widely available. My first point is that gender selection can ensure that the child and the parent will have a healthy relationship. I would like to point out before I begin this point that we are not saying that a specific gender will make the parents love the child more. We are saying that if a person wants the experience of raising a child with a specific biological gender for personal reasons, or for the experience of raising both, that the option should be available to them. Our first speaker, Zoe, has spoken to you about family balance, and how if there is a prevalence of one gender in your family, that you should be given the option to be able to raise a boy or a girl, respectively. I would like to elaborate this by saying having the power to not be able to choose will make sure that another child does not feel unwanted because they are one of many boys in a family hoping for a girl, or vice versa. This is important, as even though the parents are the one to choose the gender, thinking about the child's response has to be really considered. Children are more likely to be psychologically affected if they know their parents were hoping for a child of the opposite gender. It would be much easier if gender selection was more widely available because this issue would be avoided, resulting in a happier relationship between parent and child. My second point is that there are already many people going overseas to have a say in the gender of their child. Dr. Potter from Huntington Reproductive Center in California says about half the patients he sees for non-medical sex selection come from abroad. In September, he plans to travel to Australia for reunions with about 60 families that he helped to select their children's sex. Last year, he visited families in London, and he is also planning a trip to China. Because there is such a high demand for gender selection, why shouldn't this kind of process of gender selection be allowed anywhere? If couples are willing to pay the expenses they need to be able to undergo this process, why should we be the ones to stop them? These people who go for gender selection come from all over the world, like China, India, Australia, and the UK. Many Australians alone go each year to have their baby's gender selected because they want to balance their family or because they are really hoping for a particular gender. The IVF process is a safe process as it works basically the same as surrogates do. The egg is retrieved from the female and the sperm from the male, which is then implanted into the womb after the embryos are fertilized. This type of technology is available anywhere because gender selection is already an option for people with gender-based disorders or diseases. The success rate of having the preferred gender is around 90 to 99% because most embryos are determined to be male or female several days after fertilization. With such high success rates and knowing that it's completely safe and not harmful means for the parents, if the parents really want a specific gender child, that they are allowed to have one. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we the affirmative team firmly believe that parents should be able to choose their baby's gender. This is because it would help develop better relationships between parent and child, which is one of the primary foundations that having a baby should be based upon. Parents should be able to choose the gender of the baby, which would be more beneficial to themselves if they think they can raise a baby of that gender better than the other. With the advancements of technology that people from all over the world have been contributing to, why shouldn't gender selection be there as a safe alternative to choosing a child? We have come so far in this field, and expunging gender selection from ever being an option would just be limiting families to one side if they are unable to conceive a child of the gender they want. Success and the ability to move on in all aspects of introducing new technology that can change people's lives. Thank you.
the second negative speaker, Thomas Montague.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As the negative team, we strongly disagree with the idea that parents should be allowed to choose the gender of their child. My first point this evening is that a gender imbalance could lead to financial and economical issues, and my second point is the potential consequences and the effect that this proposed scheme will have on future generations. Before this, however, I would like to point out some of the flaws in the arguments mentioned to you by the opposition. The second affirmative speaker has told you that this scheme will promote a positive relationship between both parents and children. This is wrong because, as our first speaker mentioned, imagine finding out that your parents wouldn't love you as much as if you were a different gender. For example, one woman who was interviewed about her treatment recalled being disappointed for weeks after finding out that he had failed and she was going to have yet another boy. In which world would this promote relationships? It certainly isn't ours. As mentioned by our first speaker, Jackson, the idea of parents being allowed to choose the gender of their child could easily lead down a slippery slope into a serious issue involving gender imbalance. I will now expand upon his point and draw attention to some serious financial, economical, and employment problems that could arise as a result from this situation. As a result of this scheme, gender stereotypes could become a lot stronger and far more prominent in many cultures, as gender selection is, rather basically, a parent desiring to impose stereotypes onto their child. This new method of gender selection can also be extremely expensive, with some families willing to pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. The average cost of raising a child in Australia is estimated to be around $400,000, plus a significant sum of money just to choose the gender of your child. What's more worrying than this are the rather cheap methods of gender selection that are in use in developing countries, much akin to the analogies made by our first speaker. Instead of undergoing expensive and costly methods of sex selection, these people have the grim choice of doing one of two things. Either abort the child before they're born, solely based on their gender, or get rid of the child after they're born, solely based on their gender. Whilst a will for a baby boy in India is deep-seated, there remains a dire need for women. The sex ratio in India's regions of Daman and Diu is at an all-time low, with only 38% of the population being women. This is seriously punishing the economy. It's estimated that Indian women account for between 55 and 60% of the country's farm production, making them a vital part of food security, poverty prevention, and the success of the Indian economy. Another potentially devastating effect that this scheme could have would be on the labour market. The implementation of this scheme, coupled with the possibility of a growing gender imbalance, could tip off the gender pay gap scales by even more. According to the IMF, closing the gender gap in the labour market would raise the GDP of the USA by 5%, the UAE by 12%, Japan by 9%, and Egypt by a whopping 34%. A further imbalance of genders could cause these figures to skyrocket, costing the global economy billions, if not trillions of dollars. Now on to my second point. The medical implications of gender selection are devastatingly serious, as there are a wealth of sex-linked diseases that could become infinitely more prevalent if this scheme was introduced, due to serious gender imbalances. Currently, many countries allow gender selection for strictly medical implications, such as if the parents are known to be carriers of a sex-linked disease, such as muscular dystrophy. Giving the ability to parents for commercial reasons is extremely ignorant of the many cultural preferences of certain societies. Countries such as China and India have a deep-seated preference for male heirs, and due to the extreme likelihood of males inheriting hereditary diseases, the amount of cases would explode. Imagine having a child with muscular dystrophy, year by year, watching their strength wither away. What if a whole neighbourhood was stricken by this condition, each generation bringing more and more of the same disorder to their heirs? Examples of disorders that could bring about this situation are the aforementioned muscular dystrophy, which affects about 1 in 3,600 men, male pattern baldness, which affects about 1 in 5,000 men, and the male-only haemophilia. Similarly, there are diseases that only or mainly affect women, such as breast and ovarian cancers and Rett syndrome. A long-term consequence of parents being allowed to choose the gender of their child is a society with a higher possibility of hereditary diseases running rampant. This is not a society that we want. In conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, parents should not be allowed to choose the gender of their baby, as it could lead to a worsening economy. Thank you.
Call upon the third affirmative speaker, Ellen Klein.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of tonight's debate is that parents should be allowed to choose their baby's gender. As the affirmative team, we are adamant that this statement is true. I would now like to point out some flaws in the opposition's case. Zoe, my first speaker, talked about how preconception sex selection will aid families in achieving a balanced representation of males and females. The negative team said that this is incorrect, as overall there may be a gender imbalance in the population. For example, in China, boys are generally highly desired, while girls are less wanted. If this were to be made legal, then generally China would not have enough females to sustain a healthy mix of both. This is clearly incorrect. In China, babies are disposed of in horrifying ways. Over 10,000 are abandoned each year. However, this is usually infants suffering from Down syndrome or other diseases and illnesses. The issue that gender selection may induce an imbalance is invalid. The actual ratio for females to males in China is 1 for every 1.12, which is hardly enough to create an imbalance that would actually affect the population, even if gender selection was legalised. Furthermore, as Zoe explained, gender selection is preferable to abortions, infanticide and abandonment of unwanted children. My second speaker, Michelle, said that relationships between parents and children will be healthier. The affirmative team the negative team rebutted this by saying that this is wrong because children would soon realise that they weren't the preferred sex that their parents wanted, therefore they would be less inclined to feel good about themselves and their family. I would like to say that this is misguided because we're not saying that people will love their child less. We are saying that it will make it easier for children to form bonds with their parents. The first negative speaker's point was that parents selecting their child's gender harms them psychologically by making love for them conditional. This is incorrect. The love a parent has for a child has nothing to do with gender in the majority of cases. As Michelle said, it can actually make the relationships between parents and children more stable when the child is aware of the fact that they are the gender their parents wanted them to be. The first negative speaker also mentioned that it is cruel and morally wrong to choose your child's gender. This is wrong because, as Zoe has already said, if children are not the desired sex, postnatal depression is highly possible, risking troubled relationships with the child. The negative team have told us that parents being permitted to choose their baby's gender is likely to cause a gender imbalance in children around the world. They are making assumptions that parents will be more likely to choose one gender of child. Despite some evidence of boy babies being favoured in China and India, there is no way of knowing what will happen on a world scale, because there is no widespread data about this practice that is currently illegal in many places around the world. Even if there began to be a gender imbalance in some countries, it would quickly self-correct as the gender that they were less of would come into demand for reproduction, and people would soon realise the value of both sexes. In America, where gender selection is legal and practiced, there are 1.05 males to every female, which is very similar to the international average of 1.06 males to every female. The procedure has been in use since the early 1990s and has had no adverse effects on the balance of boys and girls in the USA. Also, as Zoe has told you, many families have said that they believe that a gender-balanced family is a definite positive, and this is something else that shows us how people are unlikely to begin only choosing a baby of one specific gender. The second negative speaker said that gender selection will exacerbate current problems with gender stereotypes in countries like India. This is false because we do not believe that this will have any impact on gender stereotypes. Current gender stereotypes are caused by age-old beliefs but mostly occur in poorer regions. In these regions, people will be less likely to be able to afford the treatment, and so it will not have an impact. We also believe that a better way to prevent these stereotypes is to possibly help educate these people better about the importance of accepting each gender equally. My first speaker, Zoe, talked about the reproductive rights of the human being. She accurately told you about how parents choosing their baby's gender has no effect on other people and how it does no harm to the mother or the baby. She spoke about gender selection through embryonic sorting and gender balancing within families. Michelle talks about relationships between parents and children and how people from all around the world are going overseas for the treatment, so we can have it here as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to finish by saying how important it is that we allow and accept gender selection. Dr. Batsofin, Medical Director of New York Fertility Services, says, if people want to avail themselves of the technology, why not? They're not hurting anyone, they're paying for it. Our team wholeheartedly agrees with this statement. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Elijah Schultz.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As the negative team, we strongly reject the assertion that parents should be allowed to choose their child's gender. As a prelude to my summary, I will now refute some of the opposition's arguments. The affirmative team's case that parents have the right to choose the gender of their baby is clearly a flawed example. If parents are permitted this much control over the features of their child, when will these technologies and rights come too far? Will we eventually be able to choose the eye colour of our children, their hair colour, their personalities? Eventually, these may turn into an obsession over creating the perfect baby. Will these transformations in these unnatural freedoms pull us back to a Hitler-esque society where this obsession is rife? Eventually, celebrities will be carrying around personally stylized babies in their designer handbags. The custom plush bear firm, Build-A-Bear, will be replaced by Build-A-Baby. This possibility is even closer, as an American genetics company, 23andMe, has patented technology that can achieve exactly these results. As our first speaker already rebutted, the affirmative team's assertion that gender selection would help to eradicate a gender imbalance is thoroughly flawed. In countries such as China and Vietnam, where there is a much larger ratio of male births to female, introducing further methods of gender selection has an extremely high chance of accentuating this imbalance, rather than amending it, due to the sexist male preferences in countries such as these. This pre-existing gender imbalance is already due to the outlawed backyard abortion of unwanted girls due to the male heir preference in Chinese society. The National State Population and Family Planning Commission has predicted that the Chinese men will outnumber women by 30 million in 2020. Imagine what would happen to these figures if the scheme was introduced. The Chinese gender imbalance reached a high of 22% more men to women in 2008, and has barely decreased since then. The affirmative team's first speaker made the assertion that preconception sex selection is moral. This is extremely opposing our definition of the topic, as we define the topic as before conception and before birth, meaning this argument is entirely irrelevant. While preconception sex selection is a worthy option, it is extremely expensive, resulting in cheaper, crueler methods being employed. The affirmative team's second speaker tried to explain the positives of the high demand for gender selection. While there may be a high demand for this, just because we have the technology doesn't mean we should use it. Due to an extreme likelihood of adverse outcomes such as an extreme gender imbalance and possibly lead to increased rates of sex-linked diseases. The third affirmative speaker tried to rebut the argument that a gender imbalance would be created, especially in China. Their reasoning was extremely incorrect. May I mention that China's 1.12 men to women ratio is insignificant. May I mention that this imbalance is the fourth highest input in the world, an imbalance by 12%. Our first speaker, Jackson, discussed the many serious ethical issues that come with gender selection and the major ethical and equality issues that are bound to arise if this scheme is introduced. Thomas, our second speaker, further developed on Jackson's point, discussing the adverse economic implications associated with this scheme, and told of the horrific medical complications future generations would receive as a result of gender selection. These reasons clearly illustrate to you, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, that parents should not be allowed to choose their baby's gender.